Thanks everyone for coming out today. And namaste, it's good to see you. In the meditation traditions I practice and teach, it's customary to take a moment to arrive. So often we go places and we don't actually ever arrive there. And so if you join me just for a moment to arrive, we'll take three deep breaths. So sitting up nice and tall with a long spine, an open heart. I'm watching 3 inhales and 3 exhales. Fully committing to being here for the next 45 minutes or so. Nice. Good. Well, speaking of the breath, growing up in Kansas, out on the dry, dusty prairie, I suffered from really bad asthma. That's a picture of home there. I spent my 6th and my 7th and my 8th birthdays in the emergency room getting breathing treatments. And I spent a week in a hospital, partially in an oxygen tank, after a really bad attack when I was 10. And I suffered a very severe attack during baseball practice my junior year of high school after our coach made us run wind sprints until we puked. I remember lying there on the ground, wheezing and sputtering with my teammates looking on, my coach standing over me, screaming at me to man up, man up. It's all in your head, you're weak, man up. He kept yelling at me as I gasped desperately for breath. Fortunately, medication and treatments for asthma have improved, and I'm in better shape now than I was then. However, I still carry a rescue inhaler with me everywhere I go. This little guy. What I learned from my asthma is at odds with the dominant messaging of our individualistic, hypermasculine, lonely, alienated, opportunistic, resentful, indebted, look at me, gotta get mine while the getting is good, us versus them, me versus the world, I built this, devil may care, neoliberal attention economy. Growing up in Kansas, I was taught the value and the virtue of self-reliance. I was told to be strong, don't depend on anyone if you can help it, always do it yourself if you can manage. And of course, like any overachieving student, I did all the group projects by myself. Every inhale and exhale teaches me the limits of the fiction of the autonomous individual. And it is a fiction, a fairy tale we recite and remember, like Alice in Wonderland or The Wizard of Oz. Every day my lungs teach me just how harmful this fiction of the autonomous individual can be, this fairy tale of self-reliance, of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, of the self-made man. At many points during my life, to insist on self-reliance would have meant certain death. Every time my anxiety about my asthma provokes an asthma attack, I understand how intimately connected my body and my mind are. Descartes be damned. To be human is to be embodied, and there is no shame in that. We are all vulnerable, we all suffer, we are all capable of healing. If there is such a thing as enlightenment, we will find it through our vulnerable, suffering, magnificent healing bodies, not by transcending them. We are not brains on a stick, if I may borrow such a lovely phrase from my dear friend, Chris Uhl. Every spring when the plants bloom, releasing their fragrant pollen into the air, every fall when the flu arrives and people start coughing and sneezing, and the leaves drop and mold fills the house, every time someone lights up a cigarette or puts on strong perfume or brings their dog into work, every time someone burns their garbage or sprays their lawn with pesticide, my breath turns ragged, my chest tightens, and I experience just how radically open my body is to the outside world and to the actions of others. Every time someone comforts me in such moments, I am reminded of just how much we need each other. just how much I need you. We might live strenuously, but we are not self-made. Life and this being that I call me is a collaboration. Each of us is an earthly ensemble made of flesh, air, and words. Each of us contains multitudes. We are fundamentally, biologically, ethically, ontologically, spiritually interconnected with each other and with the world we inhabit. We are one. As we gather today on this autumn Wednesday in late October in the midst of a global pandemic, you find me on a lifelong quest to understand the rhetorics of oneness. My mission is to investigate how people put their talk of oneness into action, how people use the rhetorics of oneness to reunite what has been split by politics and culture and religion and science and economics. We live our lives in language for better and for worse. And so my goal is to question the possibilities and the pitfalls of the rhetorics of oneness as people put them into practice in real life. My hope is that this line of research will inspire us collectively to imagine better, more ethical rhetorics of oneness moving forward. Those of you who know me well know it's hard for me to open my mouth and not show my heart. My bad lungs had an unanticipated consequence. Broken breaths cracked my heart open at an early age. Compassion through shared vulnerability is my ethical credo. Oneness is an ancient global genre. It has been called the perennial philosophy. It's not difficult to notice oneness if one looks around with an open mind and an open heart, especially right now. Turn over a stone, cleave the wood, put on a mask. It's also not difficult to say the words, "We are one," to plaster a bumper sticker on your car, to share a gif on social media, to chant Om at the end of a yoga practice, and then to continue living life just as dualistically, as competitively, as individualistically as before. Oneness is particularly prone to cliche-ification. That's fine. My goal in my new book, The Ethics of Oneness, is to move past cliches to conduct. I want to better understand what it might mean to live a life committed to oneness. The task I have set myself is to investigate oneness not as a timeless, abstract philosophical concept, but as a concrete, practical, ethical challenge. In my new book, I make a distinction between a metaphysics of oneness and an ethics of oneness. A metaphysics of oneness demands belief and is judged by the criteria of true and false. The truth will set you free, it is said. I'm not so sure. On its own, belief in the truth of oneness will not save anything. The trouble I've discovered in my research and in my teaching and in traveling the world is that belief in the truth of oneness does not entail any particular habits or practices or norms of action. A person can say we are one and still behave as a complete bastard. A person or a people can murder and kill in the name of oneness just as surely as they can pursue peace. This is why we must study how oneness is lived in thought, word, and deed, so that it does not become two-ness or enemyship or just another supercharged verbal weapon for marking some as superior and worthy and others as not. This is why we must study the rhetorics of oneness, how oneness is made real and relevant and pressing to people living rushed, distracted lives. Fortunately, American history provides us with an extensive record of practical experimentation with oneness. This is especially true during the long 19th century, the period that I study, a fascinating moment of intercultural dialogue and spiritual ferment. During the 1800s, a number of American thinkers, tempted by oneness, read and wrestled with newly translated texts of Indian philosophy. As Americans got a deeper and richer picture of Indian thought than the shallow stereotypes that were circulated by bigoted Christian missionaries about Hindus and yogis, they encountered new images and stories of oneness that vastly expanded their creative, imaginative, rhetorical powers, and also their visions of democracy. Indian philosophy is not one thing. Not all Indians are monists or yogis. However, during the 1800s, European scholars tended to present the newly translated Indian philosophical, religious texts through the lens of Advaita, non-dualistic Vedanta, in which everything is one, in Sanskrit, ekatva. Americans from the Transcendentalist to the Theosophical Society imagined Indian philosophy as a prophecy of oneness, an interpretation reinforced by the Indian gurus when they began to arrive in the 1890s and 1900s to teach yoga and meditation to Americans. This is true especially of the figure who has been called the founder of American yoga, Swami Vivekananda. And here's Vivekananda hanging out with me and Spider-Man in Kumartali, Kolkata, India, which is itself a very good story, but a story for another day, I think. In my new book, I focus on an intercultural dialogue around one text in particular, the Bhagavad Gita. The Gita is a complex composition of many voices, and Americans received it in complicated ways. In the Ethics of Oneness, I focus on two figures who loved and treasured the Gita, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman, and I describe how they built philosophies of oneness in dialogue with the core issues raised by the Gita. I show that Emerson's oneness is haunted by the brilliance of two other figures, Margaret Fuller and Henry David Thoreau, who act like his conscience, calling him and his treasured Gita out for some of their more extravagant metaphysical flourishes. Whitman challenges Emerson on key points too, and ultimately I conclude that Whitman invents a more democratic and ethically desirable oneness, one that is worth knowing today. So in my time remaining today, I want to tell you a story. And this is a story of oneness gone bad. This is a story of how a rhetoric of oneness became perhaps the most powerful argument for war ever composed. Given its status as one of the world's most beloved and best-selling Bibles, and how closely it is embraced by yogis and other warrior poets of peace today, I find it surprising, shocking even, that the Bhagavad Gita makes one of the most forceful arguments for war that has ever been articulated. The Bhagavad Gita, in English, the Lord's Song, is a pivotal chapter in the ancient Indian oral epic poem, the Mahabharata. Most contemporary Sanskrit scholars believe that the Mahabharata was composed by many bards, likely over the period of hundreds of years, and that the Gita originated at some point during the larger compositional process. It is likely that the Gita was composed in northern India, what is now northern India, sometime between the reign of the king Ashoka, 267 to 232 BCE, and the Gupta dynasty, 320 to 547 CE. So it's a big range of time. The Mahabharata tells the story of a terrible war over succession to the throne of a prominent kingdom in what is now northern India. This made for television conflict, at times Homer, at times Shakespeare, at times a really scandalous telenovela, builds to a catastrophic war at Kurukshetra, which is today about 3 hours north of New Delhi by car in heavy, heavy traffic. This war lasts for 18 days, and it draws in all the surrounding kingdoms and their armies. It involves the gods and their celestial weapons. There is heroism, treachery, and unimaginable sacrifice, and almost everyone dies. It's not a happy story. The Bhagavad Gita occurs at a key moment in the Mahabharata, right before the climactic battle is set to begin. The greatest warrior in the land, Arjuna, here on the right with the sword and the big mustache, awesome mustache, looks across the battlefield and sees his cousins, his teachers, his mentors, and his friends. Knowing that he will have to destroy them to win the war, he breaks down and he refuses to fight. But even in that state, that broken emotional state, which is described so vividly in the Gita, Arjuna makes a very powerful argument for peace. And his argument is that, isn't it contrary to Dharma, contrary to law and order, to fight and kill one's family? On the surface, and taken quite literally, the Bhagavad Gita is war rhetoric. It is a sustained discussion between two characters in the Mahabharata. One, Arjuna, who refuses to fight a battle against his kith and his kin. The other, blue-skinned Krishna, who refuses, or who his charioteer, his advisor, and secretly a god in disguise, the avatar of Vishnu. And Krishna implores Arjuna to abandon his arguments for peace, to fulfill his duty as a warrior, and to fight. To persuade Arjuna to fight, Krishna teaches him a number of lessons, including the truth of oneness, or ekatva. The individual soul, the Atman, is no different from the universal soul, the divine substratum of all existence, Brahman. Everything is God. The world is woven on the divine backgrounds like pearls on a string or beads on a thread. And as you see in this very pivotal verse from the Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna that the true yogi, the true warrior, sees the divine in all creatures and knows that all is one because all is God. The soul is God, it is oneness, it is immortal. So Krishna tells Arjuna to take comfort. So long as he believes in oneness, he will understand that even as he destroys his family and his friends' bodies, he does them no damage. And here Krishna is talking about the self, the Atman, the soul. Someone who imagines this a killer, someone who believes that this is killed. Neither of them knows this cannot kill and cannot be killed. It is not born, it does not die at any time, and having come to be will never cease to be. Birthless, undying, constant before time, this, when killed inside the body, is not killed. A man who knows the indestructible, eternal, birthless, imperishable soul, in what way, Arjuna, does he cause the killing? Who is it that kills? This embodied is invulnerable in everyone forever, Arjuna. And so for all these beings, you should not mourn. To persuade Arjuna to kill his cousins and teachers and achieve victory, Krishna teaches him the secret of war without enemyship. Most war rhetoric begins by dehumanizing the enemy, imagining them as a monster, as an animal, or as a diseased, cursed being who must be destroyed. Krishna reveals that there is no need to dehumanize the enemy. In fact, see everyone as God, he tells Arjuna. Know that your foes are one with God. Their souls are divine, but their bodies are an illusion, time-bound and destined to pass. Their immortal souls, however, never die. The Atman, the Brahman, the blessed oneness cannot be harmed or hurt or killed. To destroy the body is not to destroy the soul. God cannot be killed, and we are all God. Oneness is all, and it is eternal. Krishna therefore implores Arjuna not to fret about killing his cousins and his teachers and his friends and his family. He need not mourn for them. He will destroy their bodies, but their bodies are nothing. For souls are immortal and beyond harm. This, I imagine here, Krishna pointing to his chest, this is what weapons do not cut, he tells Arjuna. So stand up and fight. Let us pause for a moment to consider the sheer, utter audacity of this message. Oneness is real, it is the truth, Krishna says. Distinctions, variety are an illusion. The living, breathing bodies you see around you are not real. They also are an illusion. No one is killed, no one kills, for the divine oneness never dies. We are one. In the end, Krishna's arguments, which culminate in the revelation of his cosmic form, which you see here in this image, which is a 2 or 3 story tall mural on the outside of the Sri Krishna Museum in Kurukshetra in North India. And it's an image that I have to say creates quite an effect in person. In the end, Krishna's arguments are convincing. Krishna wins the argument with Arjuna. Arjuna wins the war. This, my friends, is oneness as war rhetoric. The Gita raises a topic I've come to believe is at the heart of any ethics of oneness: the body. The breathing, feeling, sensing, glorious, vulnerable, magnificent body. There's a tendency in philosophies of oneness like Advaita Vedanta of the Bhagavad Gita to downplay the reality of the body. And it is easy to see why. If everything is one, then the things that make us different, including our bodies, cannot be real. Our embodied nature is one of variety in the midst of unity, and the most severe philosophies of oneness cannot admit variety. So variety is marked as an illusion, or to use the Sanskrit word, as maya. Perhaps the most important conclusion I make in the ethics of oneness is that to deny the reality, the importance, and ultimately the sacredness of the real life individual body is to court catastrophe. This means that paradoxically enough, to be ethical, philosophies of oneness must make space for difference, disagreement, and especially death. As I said earlier, to be human is to be embodied. We are all vulnerable, we all suffer, we are all capable of healing and connection and community. If there is such a thing as enlightenment, we will find it through our vulnerable, suffering, healing bodies, not by transcending them. And I suspect we will find it together, not alone. Being mindful of our bodies, of our inhales and our exhales, of that moment when inside and outside, me and you, us and them meet, is what will crack open our hearts. The body opens us to oneness in a way that dogma cannot. It is by recognizing our mutual vulnerability and awakening our natural capacity for compassion that we can find a worthy ethics of oneness for a world in pain. Emerson treasured the Gita. He called it the first of books. In my new book, I chart Emerson's journey from a soft monism of the oversoul that admits space for difference to a much stricter, sterner philosophy of oneness that echoes Krishna's teachings in the Gita on the illusion of bodies and death and change. Emerson's mature oneness is clearest in his poem Brahma, published in the first issue of the Atlantic Monthly in November 1857. And this is a scan of the poem from that issue of the Atlantic Monthly. If the red slayer think he slays, or if the slain think he is slain, they know not well the subtle ways I keep and pass and turn again. And I think of the meaning of those words in the context of what's about to happen in the United States, and it's just almost too hard to contemplate. In Emerson's later works, including this poem, we see the seeds of a non-dualistic American Advaita, whose influence is persuasive, but whose implications have gone long unnoticed and undiscussed. There is no old age, no disease, no death, Emerson says following Krishna, refrains so many contemporary authors repeat. Why fret or worry? Let us bow down to the beautiful necessity, Emerson concludes. The oneness of the Gita and of Emersonianism I show in my book has become the bedrock of many traditions of American spirituality. For it seems every generation continues to rediscover the perennial philosophy. Old beginnings, indeed. But what really are the consequences of committing oneself to such a philosophy of oneness? Here we have a lot to learn from Walt Whitman, the poet of diversity and unity, and one of the great, to use a description of one of his friends, heroes of the enfranchisement of the body. This is a picture I took at Walt Whitman's grave in Camden, New Jersey, where he spent the last years of his life. And if you'll permit me, I'd like to finish this part of my talk today by reading from the end of the third chapter of my new book. The third chapter is called Bodies and is about bodies. And one thing that you should know so that this chapter makes sense is that Emerson lost his first son to scarlet fever when he was just 5 years old, a loss I can't even begin to imagine. And I argue in the book that the loss of his son is really what catapulted Emerson forward into a much stricter vision of oneness in which variety and difference and death are illusions, they're Maya. Grief drew Emerson even closer to the Bhagavad Gita. Emerson allowed himself to become Arjuna and to be convinced by Krishna's words, such that these words poured forth from his pen in a new language for a new audience in a new culture in his poem Brahma. Like Krishna, Emerson recognized that there is power in emotion, the power to inspire us to act, but also to throw us off balance, to divert us from what must be done. Repeatedly in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna instructs Arjuna to master his emotions, to set aside his compassion and his grief, to overcome his fear and his resentment, to fix his mind only on duty and to fight. This is no time for Arjuna to engage in anticipatory grief for his cousins and teachers and friends, no time to mourn them. Yogis are supposed to be completely balanced no matter what happens in life. And success or failure stay the same, Krishna tells Arjuna. It's said that equilibrium is yoga. And this is one common definition of yoga. Samatva, equilibrium or evenness of mind, is one of the definitions of yoga in the Gita. Looking at life from a higher plane, taking refuge in transcendent oneness, and knowing that nothing truly lives or truly dies because the soul is immortal, the yogi has learned how to master change. The mind's tornadoes are nothing to the yogi. Life's vicissitudes are nothing to the yogi. Nothing throws the yogi off balance. Why mourn, Arjuna, when there's nothing to mourn? Grief is a natural human emotion. However, for Advaita Vedanta, it is based in delusion. There is power in grief. Krishna recognizes this, and his philosophy is designed to teach Arjuna how to block this emotion so that it does not again bring him to his knees. If Arjuna grieves his opponents, he will not fight. Think of their eternal souls, Krishna therefore advises. If you understand the true ontology of oneness, you will recognize that their bodies might perish during the war, but their souls never die. So why grieve? Why mourn? There is no reason. There's freedom in yoga, the freedom to act, but we must ask, what are the costs of such freedom? There is power in grief. To grieve is to remember. To grieve is to honor. To grieve is to treat with reverence a life lived in and through a body. To grieve is to feel an absence, not just to acknowledge it, but to feel it deep in one's heart. To grieve is to meet change and loss and tragedy with respect and sadness. If Arjuna grieves, he cannot fight. Grieving is not the job of warriors and yogis in the Bhagavad Gita. The yogi knows oneness, feels eternity, and fights. After the war is over, the surviving men in the Mahabharata tell stories, spin parables, and talk philosophy in order to justify the conflict and process their emotions. The goal, it is said, is to cut the ties with the wheel of death and birth. Philosophy is the work of men in the Mahabharata. Grieving is women's work. And indeed, the book of the Mahabharata that immediately follows the doomsday war at Kurukshetra is titled The Book of the Women. In her feminist retelling of the Mahabharata, The Palace of Illusions, which is a wonderful, wonderful book, the contemporary novelist Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni transforms this book from a scene of helpless, will-less women weeping and wailing over the bodies of their dead husbands and children into a story of strong women taking charge and exercising their agency to make the world a more just place. Divakaruni's Panchali and Gandhari and Kunti and Sudhara are not pawns in a man's story, but agents who see a wrong, the terrible mistreatment of women who no longer have their husbands to defend them after the war. And they step up to right the wrong. The justice they seek and the peace they find is rooted in the recognition of loss, the very thing that Krishna refuses Arjuna in the Gita, and the very thing that Emerson refused himself after his son's death. But not Whitman. Not Whitman. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, one of the poems Whitman wrote in honor of President Lincoln after he was murdered is a magisterial, mystical poem of wonder and grief and awe that begins with a shock. Spring arrives. We know how that feels in State College. Spring arrives, the lilacs bloom, fragrant and beautiful. And at this optimistic moment of rebirth and renewal, when people can finally take a collective sigh of relief that we've survived another winter and the time has come to thaw, Whitman mourns and thinks of death. When lilacs last and the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night, I mourned, and yet shall mourn with ever returning spring. This is a jarring juxtaposition. Here, the great poet invites us into paradox. Spring, symbolized by fragrant lilacs, contains within it the seeds of change and decay. The bird's song, a harbinger of spring and life and rebirth, is a thrilling lament. As he looks at the beautiful blooming lilac bush, Whitman remembers a lost love. And I thought of him I love. The poem ends with a battle scene, armies arrayed, trumpets blaring, flags flying, bodies lying on the ground. Perhaps it is a battlefield from the Civil War. Perhaps it is Kurukshetra. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter, for in this case, the poet does not root his musings to a particular time or place. After the war ends, Whitman grieves for those who have passed. But as he grieves, he recalls the lilacs and the grass and the bird songs, knowing that they persist somewhere and also here in his memory. And he is grateful for the time that he has now. Grief does not lead him away from the battlefields and up a mountainside in search of fresh air and a better view. Grief inspires him to walk the battlefields, to face it, to remember, to mourn, and to honor. Grief draws Whitman closer to his fellows and to the world. It fires his gratefulness for what remains. For Whitman, the key to grief is how it is expressed. It's rhetoric. Does mourning lead us towards oneness and human interconnectedness or away from it? And how? Does grief encourage us to deny the reality of life or to affirm it? Whitman's grief orients him towards oneness, with the highest respect towards the embodied individuals of the world who walk on distant battlefields. Violets on their lapels, bird songs in their hearts. Thanks.
All right. Jeremy, thank you for that wonderful presentation. While you take a drink there and relax for a minute, I'll invite everyone and remind you, if you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A box. I know we're starting to get some coming in already, but while we're waiting for a few more to come in, Jeremy, one thing I found myself thinking about throughout your talk was, the ways in which you both study these topics as a scholar, but also are kind of a practitioner of them in your yoga and your meditation practice. So I'm wondering how you see those two things. Are they two sides of the same coin, or what relationship do they have in your mind?
Thanks for that question, Jenna, and thanks everyone for listening today. It's really the first opportunity I've had to share some of this new work, and yeah, and I'm excited for your questions. I think that I don't know. I think that the kinds of ideas we work with as academics, our philosophies, our theories, really should cut straight to the heart and to the bone. And so I think that the real mark of the ideas and philosophies we study is how we live them. And so for me, studying oneness has been about trying to better understand, the traditions of yoga and meditation that I practice and that I teach. But it's also really a provocation and a challenge for me every day to think about how can I embody traditions of compassion through vulnerability and how I interact with others. And so I don't know, for a long time, they felt separate to me, like what I was studying and what I was doing in the rest of my life. And that came to feel really uncomfortable. It was actually after returning from India, I don't know, probably the third time that I went, that it felt like these aspects of my life just needed to become themselves holistic. And so that's really what I'm trying to embody now. So thank you for that question. It's a great
Yeah,
question.
yeah, sure. Um, So, and then, thinking about this notion of the body that you referenced, we are in this time, of course, where we are not physically together, in many situations, including this one we find ourselves in today. So, how are you thinking about that notion of the body and connections between and among bodies in this time of social distancing?
Sure. I think that one of the things that's most challenging about this moment, I mean, aside from, let's just acknowledge it. I mean, it's just as a moment of existential angst, right? I mean, and there's the constant temptation to pretend as though everything is normal when it's not. Whatever normal means, right? And I don't particularly want to return to the what was normal before for many reasons. But I think that one of the things that's most challenging about this time right now is the fact that we can't be together in person, that we can't hug and be physically present, because there's something about emotions that are catchy, right? I mean, people who study emotions and affect know this. I think that it becomes an interesting practice of caring and compassion then to be able to actually keep our distance physically, while emotionally trying to be there as best we can for others.
Mhm,
It's been interesting actually teaching yoga online through Zoom. I was quite hesitant about it initially, and it's not the same. And it's not, teaching my graduate seminar this semester. It's not the same as being physically present, but it's not bad actually either. And when I have Zoom open, talking with dear friends, it almost can be like they're across the way from us, like on the couch, though it's not the same. But I think that being there for others and being supportive is not just about being physically present, but also
mhm,
about being emotionally present and available. And so I've been amazed at how well people have adapted to that. I think oneness, I ended up writing a couple of new paragraphs for the conclusion of this book in relationship to the pandemic, because I think this is a moment. At least I argue in the book, it's a moment of oneness panic for a lot of people, where people all of a sudden realize, oh, wow, we actually are interconnected in ways
mhm,
that either I didn't realize or I was just ignoring. And that recognition of true interconnectedness and bodily vulnerability can be so jarring and disruptive. And so learning how to manage that together, I think, becomes really
mhm,
important.
mhm.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we've got some really great questions coming in here now through the Q&A. Um, One is about how integral is caste to determining Dharma and the Gita's framework, and can we perhaps use the Gita and philosophies of oneness while ignoring or kind of moving away from what this person describes as caste-based baggage?
Yes, that's a wonderful question that I talk about at length in the book. The argument that is made, it's related to this argument about oneness and about the eternal nature of the soul in the Gita. But in a very base sense, actually, the argument Krishna is making to Arjuna is that as a member of the Kshatriya caste, the warrior caste, Arjuna's job is to fight. And he has no choice about that job. I mean, he has to do his duty. And so there's a very famous verse in the Gita where Krishna talks about how um, to do one's duty is joy, but to do the duty of another person is sin. And a lot of contemporary yogis read that and say, yeah, I should do what feels good to me, right? That's not what Krishna is saying at all there, actually. What he's saying is that as a member of a caste, you have prescribed duties and you have to perform them. I love Thoreau because Thoreau, in one of his meditations on the Gita, explicitly brings this up. And he says, what Krishna is telling Arjuna to do, his duty, is an arbitrary duty that's related to a particular moment, a particular culture, and a particular society. And it is not a duty that applies in our world, is what Thoreau does. Now, I think we could argue that we have our own kinds of class systems in the United States. There's a wonderful book that I've been reading that's called Caste, and it makes an argument there have been three major caste systems in the world. There's the caste system in India, the caste system in Nazi Germany, and then the caste system in the United States, which is manifests itself through race, is the argument that the author makes in that just wonderful book. I think one of the interesting things is the attempt to try to make an argument for oneness that is not caste or class based. In the United States, it becomes a very individualistic argument that I have the authority and the right to determine for myself what my duty is, which in many ways I value. But that also can fracture us in really interesting ways and make us even more individualistic. And so whoever asked the question about caste, thank you for that. Great question.
Yeah, and that actually leads right into another question about how can educational institutions, movements for social justice, these types of things tap into that sense of oneness amid this individuality where competition defines success, that notion of a very heavy focus on individual agency that you were just talking about.
Yeah, again, thank you for that. That's a great question and a big question. I mean, one that I think far transcends the minutes that we have left today. And I say that not to stall, but really to recognize that that question, I think, is one that would be better answered collectively together rather than by me. Like, I would love if we had another hour to hear what people have to say about that. I think that going back to the difference between a metaphysics and an ethics of oneness, a metaphysics of oneness tends to be very top down, and it tends to be something that we're asked to believe in. So the world is one. Do you believe that or not? And fine, right? I mean, I think that how we try to embody that in our lives is more important than whether we believe it or not. And so to me, I see it less as a proposition of true or false and more as a provocation for action. I think that if oneness is going to be a positive force for social progressive justice, it has to be a oneness that recognizes the reality of the body. And I think it has to be a oneness that's rooted in our mutual vulnerability, as opposed to our mutual eternal divine nature. And I know in my own teaching and my own practice and my own life that really beginning to recognize others as embodied beings who are open and vulnerable, who suffer and also have the capacity for healing, that's a really powerful practice, actually. I think that a lot of times it's pretty easy to talk about these things in the abstract, but then when you try to actually really embody them and practice them, they can become really powerful. And so I think that's my initial thought. I mean, I actually have a lot to say about this in the book too, in the conclusion to the book, because I think that's ultimately where conversations about oneness need to go. And I think we also have to recognize the ways that rhetorics of oneness go wrong, right? Rhetorics of oneness very easily can become rhetorics of us versus them, where, by oneness, I mean people who are like me, not those people who are like different or something like that, right? I mean, people who are part of my tribe or my family. And so it becomes really easy to reinscribe logics of opposition into rhetorics of oneness, which I think is fascinating, actually. So yeah, great question.
Yeah. Somewhat related to that theme, question here about how do you connect with others who refuse to connect with you as one? I think maybe talking more about this notion of putting some of these ideas and these concepts into practice.
Yeah. I mean, I think again, that's um, ultimately one of the questions that an ethics of oneness has to answer. And it's challenging because we have so many powerful rhetorics of hate and resentment and enemyship today. And so how do we embody an ethics of oneness when engaging with people who don't want to see things as one? They don't want to engage with compassion. They want to, use hateful rhetoric or whatnot. I think that Whitman, it's interesting. Emerson has an answer to this question. I don't find it very adequate. Whitman has an answer to this question that I like quite a bit, but I think is unrealistic. And I think it asks too much of people who are often very vulnerable. And I think the Gita has an answer to this question that I don't particularly like either. But I think for me, I at least try to imagine and remember that people who refuse to see things as one, or just more people who are engaged in hateful politics of resentment, themselves are human beings who are embodied, themselves who are vulnerable and open to the world in ways that they might themselves deny. And that I tend to think that a lot of the hatred is rooted in an unwillingness to deal with that vulnerability. And so that doesn't, does that bring about change? No, it doesn't. I mean, that's an individual reorientation towards another. But I think those reorientations can be important too. So, yeah. Do we have
Great.
time for any more questions?
Yeah, maybe one or two more. I know I do see some folks posting that they have to drop off. So thank you. If you need to go for something at 1 o'clock, thank you for joining us today. But for those who can stay, we'll just take another question or two here. So thinking about this notion of oneness in the political realm, someone asked, how can a political leader reach oneness for his people, the world? They included specific examples of, maybe this is, military interventions or trade wars that might be launched for the sake of American benefit was the particular example. But other people, leaders from other countries have certainly made these arguments as well. So how do you see this playing out in the political sphere?
Well, I think we could answer that question in two different ways. One of them would be just historically, to actually look at historically how rhetorics of oneness and appeals to oneness have been used politically. And I think that, in my book on resentment, I talk quite a bit about the e pluribus unum metaphor that's on our money, out of many one. And I make the argument in that book, and then that kind of comes back in the ethics of oneness, that sometimes oneness is imagined to be me universalizing my perspective so that everyone comes to see things as I do, or me or like a people or like a country trying to dominate others and force them to become one with them. And I think that those are ways that rhetorics of oneness have been historically deployed. I would not consider them to be ethical, actually,
Mhm.
because ultimately they're not recognizing the dignity of actual lived human bodies, right?
Mhm.
They're erasing the dignity of real living people in a kind of quest for domination. And so I think we have to recognize that oneness sometimes is used in rhetorics of war and domination, like in the Bhagavad Gita, actually.
Mhm.
And I think that by reckoning with that history, we might be able to articulate better, more ethical rhetorics moving forward.
Great. We'll just take two more questions here. Um,
Yeah.
so let's see, where do I want to go here? So is this person commented on they love your notion of vulnerability and accessibility across disciplines. They're asking, what role, if any, does compassion play in the Gita, and how does this reconcile with Krishna's disembodied, non-personalized sense of engaging with oneness?
Yeah. I mean, Krishna does talk about compassion, karuna, in the Gita. And I mean, the Gita is such an interesting, so there's 18 chapters of the Gita. And in a lot of ways, the Gita was intended to be um, kind of like a summary of Indian philosophy, but rearticulation of Indian philosophy through a Brahmanical lens, so that kind of what would become like Hinduism. It wasn't called Hinduism at that point, but the Brahmanical class system and a belief in a creator God, that would become the core philosophy, and everything else is kind of incorporated into it. I tend to see Krishna's talk about compassion in the Gita being an incorporation from Buddhism, which was another current, philosophical spiritual tradition in India during the moment where this text is being composed. And compassion in Buddhism is rooted deeply in bodily vulnerability, at least in the traditions of Buddhism I study. And how you can be compassionate to people while killing them, I don't understand. Um, but that is one of the arguments that the text makes. Some people, and there's many different ways to read that, but that for me is a hard idea to stomach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we'll end, I think, with this question. We've been talking about the pandemic throughout. This person's asking if you could say more about grief as an ethical or perhaps even a political practice, and thinking about uh, or how you're thinking about mourning in the pandemic, which, as we've been talking about, has fractured social bonds and also highlighted interdependency.
Yeah. Isn't it noteworthy that, you know, upwards of 230,000 people have died in the United States, more than died during World War I and World War II. But yet our political leader has not once taken a moment to grieve or mourn for them. I think that's very telling, actually. And I think to grieve and to mourn is to recognize the reality of suffering. It is to recognize the reality of change, and it is to recognize the reality of death. And to do that fundamentally reorients our relationship to life in ways that are very contrary to the ways that many Americans live their lives today. And so I think that's why there hasn't been a kind of moment of public grieving or mourning, at least from this particular administration. I do think that's why you see swelling up democratically in moments of, rebellion and calls for social change that we see through issues and topics related to race and policing. So much of that is an attempt to call on people to grieve and to mourn and to recognize loss. And again, I think that to really recognize the reality of change and death and loss demands that we reorient the way we live our lives in ways that are really uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of people. And so it's easier to sublimate it and to not, just to not engage it. And so that's one of the things that I love the most about this book project that I worked on, is that it begins with a text that talks about oneness in terms of this timeless essence that never changes and never dies, the Bhagavad Gita. And it ends with thinking about grieving and mourning and bodily vulnerability. And I think those are both traditions of oneness. And I clearly prefer one over the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One final question here about the book. We see in philosophical thought tensions that emerge between universal obligation and particular obligation. Do you see that tension in an ethics of oneness?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. And I think that, I think oneness tends naturally towards talk about universal obligations, but I think that the power of an embodied oneness comes in thinking about our particular obligations to actual embodied individuals. Um, and so I do think that that potentially is a tension here. But I would see it as an opportunity for us to continue to think deeply about how might these traditions actually be embodied. Um, so, yeah, I could talk a lot more about
Hmm.
that, but we're
Okay,
we're out of. So, yeah,
great. Yeah, and I think most folks know how to reach you if there are follow-up
yeah,
questions
please.
or other conversations to continue. But otherwise, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Xiaoye, and thank you to all of you for attending. And um, enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a great week.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It's so nice to share this time with you. So, yeah, and thank you, Xiaoye,
Thank you.
for